But for tonight, we have with us Dr. John Reeves. And let me introduce him as I also kind of work to put him up there on the screen. All right. So Dr. John Reeves graduated Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in economics from Syracuse University in 1984. Later, he received his master's in European history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and then pursued his Ph.D. in history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And he has taught European and American history at Lehman College, Bronx Community College, and Southbank University in London. In his previous book, The Lost Indictment of Robert E. Lee, was published in 2018. He was actually present at the museum in person to do a talk on this book. This book was endorsed by James McPherson. It was also reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. And John also spoke about it at the Virginia Festival of the Book in March of 2019. And tonight he is here virtually to talk about his newest book, A Fire in the Wilderness, the battle between Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. So let me turn the screen over to John Reeves. Welcome.
Oh, welcome. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for having me. And I'm really looking forward to talking about my book tonight, A Fire in the Wilderness. Before I begin, I think I'd just like to note that today is the 157th anniversary of Grant's disastrous assault on Cold Harbor. And he lost several thousand casualties in an hour. And it was considered a pretty horrific episode of the Civil War. And in his memoirs, Grant wrote, "The assault cost us heavily and probably without benefit to compensate. I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made." So as many of you know, Cold Harbor came toward the end of Grant's overland campaign, which was, extraordinarily costly, 55,000 casualties in May and June of 1864. And it was brutal fighting, almost half the amount of people that started out the campaign. Of course, it was replenished with reinforcements. So it wasn't quite a 50% casualty rate, but nonetheless, an extremely costly campaign. And so that was the end of the Overland Campaign. Tonight, we're going to talk about the beginning of the Overland Campaign, when Grant crosses the Rapidan River and then fights the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5th and May 6th of 1864. Just to get everyone up to speed, most of you probably know about the Battle of the Wilderness, but just to kind of give a few facts about it, it started on May 4th when Grant crossed the Rapidan River trying to get around Lee's right. They fought for 2 days. It was just a bloody, horrific battle in the woods. For 2 days. There were a lot of back and forth, reversals of fortune, but ultimately it was a stalemate, but with extremely heavy casualties. And then they moved on to Spotsylvania Courthouse. And we're going to talk about all of that in a little bit. Later, what I'll start maybe by talking a little bit about the confrontation between Lee and Grant. And then I want to talk about the experience of ordinary soldiers in the wilderness and a little bit about medicine and a few other things. But one of the things as we consider the Overland Campaign, that the experience for the ordinary soldier was extremely grim. If you were in the Union Army in May 4th or May 5th in 1864, your prospects weren't good. The obvious one is that you could be killed. And that's obviously the worst outcome. But it was even worse than that, because as in the book, This Republic of Suffering, the author makes the point about this notion of the good death. And a good death was one where you died at home, surrounded by your family, and you had people by your bedside, and maybe you'd have some dramatic last final words, and people would witness your final moments, and then they would be able to talk about it, and there was some sort of finality to all that. At the Battle of the Wilderness, you have the opposite, right? That, there's the danger that you could be killed in the woods and not be found by anyone and just be left to for eternity, and your body never recovered and your loved ones never know whether you died or not. And so you can imagine that not only was death the worst outcome, but the anxiety that you would have that sort of death was on these soldiers' minds. Another thing about the ordinary soldiers in the line in May 1864 was that, you could get killed or you could get wounded. And I won't go through the sort of what the gruesome wounds were like, and many of you know about that. But one of the things about being wounded back then too is that you weren't really out of the woods yet by just a wound, because you might get an infection or you might get a secondary hemorrhage where you would have sort of an artery break or get cut and bleed, and then you die. And I write about that in the book. One of the soldiers gets wounded as the Battle of the Wilderness opens, and his wound wasn't really that bad, and probably nowadays he would have survived. But unfortunately, he did die of a secondary hemorrhage about 8 days later. And so being wounded was a sort of a dicey proposition as well. And then, of course, being captured was an awful thing that you didn't want to have happen either. And many of the soldiers at the Wilderness that were taken captive were marched down to Andersonville prison, and of course the experiences there were terrible. Many of the soldiers wished they were just killed on the battlefield, because the journey was the ordeal, and of course they were subject to bowel diseases, and most people died by dysentery or diarrhea or things like that. So being captured was a really horrific outcome, and certainly not anything you wanted. So anyway, I just go through some of those things because the odds of making it intact as you crossed the Rapidan River on May 4th, 1864 were pretty, the probabilities were low, and the possible outcomes were very grim. So you can imagine the anxieties and fears as these soldiers went into battle on May 5th and May 6th. Okay, I'd like to start by sharing with you a little bit about why I wrote this book, why the Battle of the Wilderness. So I've been reading about the Civil War my whole life, and I've always been sort of haunted by the Battle of the Wilderness. It seemed like the most horrific of all the Civil War battles to me, particularly because fire broke out in the woods on several occasions. So, it was hot in the woods those 2 days. And I think the temperature was in the mid 90 degrees, which is hot for Northern Virginia in early May. And it would have felt hotter too to the soldiers from upstate New York and Pennsylvania. But it was hot, and the paper from the cartridges was hot, and as it landed on the dry leaves of the floor of the forest, it set off fires, and there were fires on different occasions. Perhaps 200 or so soldiers died of being engulfed by flames. If you were wounded, you really couldn't run away or escape the flames. And in addition to the 200, though, it was the fear, it was the anxiety that this would happen to you. Maybe you would turn an ankle, or you would hurt your knee, or you would get shot in the leg, and you would be lying there and you could see the fires. And you can imagine it would be almost like the apocalypse, right, to be sitting there. And the soldiers were fearful about this, and they knew that it could happen. It's not something that just happened and they didn't know it was going to happen. They suspected it might beforehand. Fires had a problem in Chancellorsville a year earlier. And so this was another fear, just one of the many things that these soldiers had to worry about as they entered the battle. Another reason, so I wanted to understand that sort of horror of the wilderness when I set out to write this book. Another thing that I was looking at, I've always been interested in the experience of the wounded. And so with the wilderness, you had this odyssey after the battle where the soldiers were taken by wagon to makeshift hospitals in Fredericksburg, and then they were taken to Belle Plaine and then up by steamer to Washington, D.C., to the hospitals there, the general hospitals there. So, this took several days, or more. And, at one point, I have a chapter in the book called The Army of the Wounded. And at one point, the train of wounded was 7 miles long. And it was 7,000 wounded soldiers with 813 vehicles on the road from the Wilderness to Fredericksburg. So you can imagine this odyssey and this terrible experience. Sadly, about 1,000 of the soldiers had to be left behind because their wounds were considered so severe that they were sort of seen as, hopeless cases. And so they not only did they risk their lives and sacrifice their lives for their country, but they were left behind. Some were killed, some died, some were captured, others were rescued. But nonetheless, 1,000 or so just left to fend for themselves and weren't able to join the train. One of the things that always struck me and I wanted to learn more about too is some of you may have broken bones before, broken an arm or a leg or maybe a jaw. And that you might know that when you break a bone, the one thing you want to do is be still. Because if you move with a broken bone, the pain is excruciating, right? Especially if it hasn't been set properly and you don't have proper medication. Well, some of these soldiers had broken limbs and broken jaws and what have you, and they were riding in wagons over really bad roads. And you can imagine the pain of that, right? Being in the wagons for hours and hours and hours. And so just trying to capture that experience was another thing I wanted to do as I delved into the research for this book. And then finally, one idea that struck me as I was doing my research and I was considering writing this book was something that Frederick Douglass once said at Arlington Cemetery shortly after the war. And he said in a speech, he said, "We must never forget that victory to the rebellion meant death to the Republic. We must never forget that the loyal soldiers who rest beneath this sod flung themselves between the nation and the nation's destroyers." So that was something I wanted to explore a little bit, is that the Civil War is often portrayed as, both sides fought well and they were brave and they were honorable. And that's of course true to a certain extent. But it's also true that, one side was fighting to preserve the Union. And some of the soldiers within that larger group were also fighting to end slavery. And so putting this battle of the wilderness in some sort of moral framework, that one side was fighting for these positive values and the other side was fighting for, secession or to uphold slavery or what have you, I felt was something to consider. And the book is presented from the perspective of Union soldiers. And in some respects, this book is an attempt to describe the costs associated with fighting for the Union. That, there were obviously huge economic and financial costs, but there were also human costs. There were, deaths and suffering and these sorts of things. Walt Whitman, the poet Walt Whitman wrote, "Will the America of the future, will this vast, rich Union ever realize what itself cost back there after all?" And I thought that was such a really good framing question. Do we remember what it took to preserve the Republic? Many soldiers compared the Battle of the Wilderness to Dante's Inferno, and the more literate, the more literary soldiers. And I think that's a good comparison, right? You have the flames and you have the suffering, of course. But I also think that in one respect, it's like the Dante's Inferno, because the wilderness was something symbolically that the United States had to pass through in order to preserve the Union, much like the Inferno was something Dante had to pass through in order to get to the Paradiso, which is the conclusion of his poetic work. And so hell, of course, is also a punishment, right? And so this notion of it being Dante's Inferno, it's almost as if America was somehow being punished, and this was the price, this battle, this horrific battle. And a couple of the writers that I read did look at it in those terms, that this was sort of a punishment for America's sins. So I think that there are a lot of these themes when you look at the wilderness. And but as I said, one of the things that attracted to me to this topic was this horror and trying to understand it, and what did that mean for us. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a little bit about the central confrontation, and the subtitle of my book, and that is this engagement between Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. And it was the first time the two most celebrated generals of the Civil War met each other in the field. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that. The view of both generals has changed over time. Of course, Lee, right, shortly after his death, he became a myth, right? The lost cause myth surrounding Lee, where he could literally do no wrong in the decades after his death. And in fact, you know, his closest disciples felt not only could he do no wrong, that a loss like Gettysburg had to have some explanation. And so they had to look for a scapegoat, which of course ended up being James Longstreet. And but surely it couldn't be Lee. And so this kind of Lee myth continued throughout the 20th century. And it's only recently where you're starting to see a reevaluation of Lee, right? And he's being criticized as being a traitor and criticized for his positions on slavery. I think that still, though, the notion that he was one of the two top generals of the Civil War still remains the sort of orthodox opinion. But who knows, that might change in the future. But Grant's reputation has sort of ebbed and flowed, right, over the years. So where Lee, it sort of was upward towards the Lee myth, Grant's has gone back and forth. Shortly after the war, I think he was a hero. Everyone felt like he was the man who won the war. But then, and these two things are not unrelated, as the Lee myth took hold, Grant somehow was seen as inferior. He was seen as a butcher. And oh, the only reason he was able to succeed is that he had more men and more resources. And but he wasn't the tactician that General Lee was, and that he wasn't, didn't have a good reputation. And then, of course, you know, Grant, as I said, it's ebbing and flowing. I think that's changed, right? In recent years, that the Grant's reputation has improved again. And I think now everyone sees Grant as one of the key reasons for victory, and that what was seen as him being a butcher has now been seen now as maybe his persistence and his ability to kind of just keep going in a way that maybe other Union generals couldn't. So I just think that that contrast between the two is interesting. Instead of going kind of blow by blow and minute by minute in the woods, I think tonight I'd like to share a couple episodes from each person, from each general. And these episodes happened in the wilderness, but they're still remembered today, and they're a key part of each of the leaders' legacies. And so I think if we look at both, they allow us to go a little more deeper in our comparison of the two. The first one I'd like to talk to is the famous Lee to the rear episode, which happened in the wilderness on the second day, May 6th, 1864. On the first day, on May 5th, Lee had spent most of the day with A.P. Hill's Corps at the Orange Plank Road, which is, you know, if you're looking at the Battle of the Wilderness, it's the southern road that intersects with the Brock Road. So it was there's two main theaters, the Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road at the Battle of the Wilderness. And Lee is with Hill at the Orange Plank Road on day one. And the Confederates fought very well, and they were able to hold off Hancock's superior numbers, though just in time. I mean, when nightfall came, it was a close call, but they were able to fight well. And then as nightfall came, they were lucky that Hancock didn't have an extra hour, because he may have been able to bring his superior numbers to bear. But that's key to what happens next, because it's nighttime. The Hill's men had fought well, but they're tired, they're exhausted. So both Hill and Lee say, let the guys sleep where they fall, sleep on their arms, and we'll sort it out in the morning. Longstreet will be up by then, and he can take over and take on the lion's share of the fighting and give Hill's men a much needed respite. The problem with that, of course, though, is if Longstreet doesn't show up in time, Hill's men are going to be swept away by Hancock because they're kind of not, they haven't prepared defensive positions and they haven't dug in and they haven't realigned and all of those things. And sure enough, that's what happens. Longstreet is late and Lee and Hill are desperate, and Hill's men get pushed back by Hancock, and it looks like a rout, and it looks like Lee is in serious trouble and his whole army could be destroyed that morning. And just like out of a Hollywood blockbuster movie, who comes up the road at the last minute is Longstreet. So Longstreet arrives just in the nick of time, and his Texas Brigade arrives at the Widow Tapp's field. And the Texas Brigade is about to cross, and Lee is fired up with emotion, and he decides he wants to lead the brigade across the field himself. And he's very emotional. And of course, the Texans think that this is suicidal and madness, and they say, Lee, to the rear, you will go forward, but you need to go back. And at that point, James Longstreet reports that Lee was off his balance, that he had really just gone very reckless. But fortunately for the Confederacy, Lee doesn't lead the Texas Brigade across the Widow Tap field, and the casualties were enormous. The Texas Brigade lost probably over 50% of their men, 447 soldiers out of 850. 457 casualties out of 850 that started. So had Lee gone leading that brigade, he probably would have been a casualty himself, either killed or wounded. So this Lee to the rear, I give you a little detail because this Lee to the rear episode became part of the Lee myth after the war. And it was this sort of Christ-like character willing to lay down his life on behalf of the Confederacy, only to be stopped by his loyal soldiers who felt he was too important to be doing such a thing, and they urged him back. And of course, there's a lot of truth to this too. There's a lot of firsthand accounts of that's what happened. But it did become part of the Lee myth and this sort of like a larger than life figure. And you've seen some of the images of him. It's almost like a medieval knight wanting to lead his knights into battle. The irony about all this is that the Lee to the rear episode really illustrates just how human Lee was, right? Instead of being a saint-like figure, he's someone who loses control and does something very impulsive because he recognized that if he didn't stop the Union right then and there, that his army might get swept away. And so he recognized the urgency and he felt he had to jump into action. One interesting thing about this is that Grant recognized, Riley wrote in his memoirs, like, hey, if it comes down to the point where a commanding general needs to lead a brigade into action, things mustn't be going so well. And of course, Grant is saying that in his memoirs in reference to Sidney Johnston, who did something similar at the Battle of Shiloh, and of course is mortally wounded, thereby, having a huge impact on the ultimate outcome of the Battle of Shiloh. So I think that's one way of Grant getting a sort of dig in there. It's like, but nevertheless, that's the Lee to the rear episode. It happened in the wilderness. It's something that's still remembered, and I think it tells us a lot about Lee, but also the position of his army at that time. Some of you may know that this story has been in the news recently, and that there's a controversy right now at the University of Texas over the Texas song called The Eyes of Texas. And The Eyes of Texas, there are many people at the University of Texas who want to do away with that. They want to replace The Eyes of Texas as a song. It was first performed by white students in blackface, so it was seen as a racist origins, right? But it was also had a connection to Lee. It was thought that the Eyes of Texas was an expression, the eyes of the Confederacy, that Lee had said while he was president at Washington and Lee University. But we've actually learned that this Eyes of Texas line comes from the lead of the rear episode. And that while the Texans were about to go into battle and Lee was told to go to the rear, General John Gregg, who was leading the Texans, said to his men, boys, the eyes of Robert E. Lee are upon you. And then they went into battle, and now that's, of course, that eventually became the origin of the Eyes of Texas, which was said by, I think, a Texas University president at the turn of the century. Anyway, I just stop and mention that only because, the wilderness is still with us today, and these controversies are still playing out. And I think I mentioned earlier this notion about the sort of moral dimension of the war and what did that mean? And I think that for some people, just the connection of the Eyes of Texas with fighting for the Confederacy or fighting for secession means that that song needs to be replaced. I'm not taking that position myself, but I just think that it's interesting that that's come up, and there are many people that believe that this song somehow is tainted by being associated with Lee. But it did originate in the Battle of the Wilderness, in the Lead to the Rear episode. So moving to Grant. So just like Lee, Grant has a famous moment at the Battle of the Wilderness that I think many of us still remember, but is crucial to understanding Ulysses S. Grant. And during the second day of the battle on May 6th, when first it looked good for the Union in the morning, but then the Confederacy was able to then turn Hancock's right and threaten Grant's army. And then later that evening, they were threatened his left. And so you've got on May 6th, Grant sort of 2 days of getting pummeled, high casualties, nothing really to show for it, a stalemate, having his flanks threatened. The Battle of the Wilderness didn't really look like a good result for Grant. Nevertheless, on May 6th, he makes the decision that he's heading south to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and that on the morning of March 7th, he issues an order to his army that there would be a night march that evening. And so despite these horrific casualties, Grant's moving forward. It's not going to stop him. And in fact, to him, it didn't mean anything. His original plan remained the same. And I write in my book, some of you might know that the General Hooker, a year prior at the Battle of Chancellorsville, had similar casualties, but he kind of lost his nerve and went back over the Rappahannock River. I write in my book, unlike General Hooker at Chancellorsville, who had said he lost faith in Joe Hooker, Grant never lost faith in himself or the campaign. And so I think that this became part of what the Grant legacy, right? This stubborn persistence, this, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to fight along this line all summer. And it really is, I think, one of the memories we should have about Grant, that one of his strengths as a commander was that toughness and that sort of moral courage that could kind of withstand something so horrible as the Wilderness was, but keep to his plan and not be sidetracked by it. I think it's actually remarkable. It's a remarkable thing about Grant, to be honest. And one of the flip sides, though, of the night march, because I think that we often remember it in literature and images of the Union soldiers cheering, Grant has decided to go to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and it was a morale booster for the Union Army. But in fact, the night march was sort of a debacle. It was dark. They didn't know where they were going. They got lost on several occasions. And Lee's army was able to beat the Union Army to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and it bogged down. And of course, the next thing was another huge battle and sort of an ongoing fight, which was the Overland Campaign. And so there's sort of a mixed bag with the night march to Spotsylvania Courthouse. But I do think just the decision alone was one of the most important decisions of the Civil War. So just briefly kind of comparing their performance, it's funny because both Lee and Grant had sort of mixed results in the Wilderness. Like neither one of them appeared at their best. Lee was aggressive. He put the pressure. Put the pressure on the Union Army. He surprised Grant and Meade. But at the same time, he also launched a sort of costly assault late in the day on May 6th that probably shouldn't have been done. And he took a lot of casualties that couldn't be replaced. So engaging in a slugfest at the Wilderness may have not have been a good idea on Lee's part, but nonetheless, he felt that he had no choice but to do so. For Grant's part, there was a lot of miscommunication between his commanders. Burnside's Ninth Corps reported directly to Ulysses Grant, and it was sort of a non-factor for the most part. Some historians might disagree with that, but I don't think Burnside really accomplished much over the 2 days. But one observer said, and I really like this of Grant, he said, the Union Army fought well. Grant made some mistakes, but there was something remorseless even in Grant's mistakes. And I think that's a good description of sort of Grant. And for Lee, I would say maybe that despite having fewer men, he was still dangerous and still had the possibility of pushing Grant back over the Rapidan River at the Wilderness. I make the argument that as the overland campaign went on and the losses piled up for Lee, his options became fewer and fewer. I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, but you could easily make the case that the Wilderness may have been Lee's last chance for some sort of victory that would lead to maybe a negotiated peace. Because if Grant's campaign in the spring had failed, then it's very likely that Lincoln may not have won election in November of 1864, and then the new president may have been willing to just kind of come up with some sort of peace settlement. So the Wilderness did have a lot of ramifications, and Lee was a danger of the entire time in those woods. One interesting thing that I note in the book that I think is a little bit dishonest by both Lee and Grant is that when asked after the war who their most dangerous rival was, Grant said, well, surely it was Joseph Johnston was my most feared enemy commander. And Lee said it was McClellan, Obviously, I think that's both of their kind of, I think that it's clear that they both knew that each other was their biggest rival, but they were proud men and they didn't want to admit it. And in Grant's memoirs, he writes a lot about how he felt resentful of all the praise that Lee received for what he did. And Grant makes an extended argument about how what he did was actually harder because he was on the offensive and he didn't have the luxury of using slave labor to work the home front like Lee did. And he makes these other points that, so Grant is resentful of Lee because Lee got more credit, or so he thought. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting kind of footnote that these two commanders both trying to minimize the other as being successful. So that's a little bit about Grant versus Lee, and now I'd like to talk more about the ordinary soldiers at the Battle of the Wilderness. One of the main ordinary soldiers I write about is someone named Private William Reeves of the 76th New York Regiment. Now, I am not related to Private William Reeves, despite the similarity in the names, but he is, his family came to America in the 18th century, and my family came in the late 19th century. So very unlikely that we're related in a direct way. But the reason I chose Private William Reeves is that he was someone who was an ordinary recruit who was wounded, and then he participated in that odyssey that I spoke about earlier, from the Wilderness to Fredericksburg up to a hospital, Stanton General Hospital in Washington, D.C. And then sadly, he's the person who had the secondary hemorrhage just as he's admitted to the hospital and died. And he became the 4th person buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And it's interesting to me, sort of an interesting symbolic connection, right? That Arlington National Cemetery used to be the estate of Robert E. Lee's family, and that these soldiers who were fighting him in the wilderness are now being buried in the fields of his estate. Reeves was the. It's funny because there's two early battlefield casualties. William Blatt, it was the third burial, and he was wounded on May 10th. And Reeves was the fourth burial, but he was wounded on May 5th. Within minutes, within seconds of the opening of the Battle of the Wilderness, Private William Reeves. Reeves was, unfortunately for me, he didn't write. I didn't find any letters or diaries. I didn't have his personal thoughts about the struggle. But one rich source that I did have was his medical file. And that was something that was attractive to me because I wanted to write a little bit about medicine. And I actually consulted with my brother-in-law, who's a doctor, and I shared Reeves's medical file. Like I said, it was actually a pretty detailed medical file, and we were able to go over and look at it very closely. And so it was a tremendously helpful primary source, the medical information about Reeves. And we of course had his military file too, but sadly it would have been great if he had some letters. He got married the day before, a couple days before he signed up. He volunteered as a substitute. So he received $300 as a substitute, presumably wanting to start a small farm up in Victor, New York, where he was from. He was only 19 years old. And one of the things I noticed from his medical file is Reeves was assigned to guard the ammunition train. So he, for most of his time in the service prior to the Battle of the Wilderness, he really hadn't seen any action and probably wasn't well trained. He was very slight. He was small, didn't weigh very much. 19. The poor guy probably wasn't a formidable soldier by any stretch of the imagination. And so I can only imagine the terror it must have felt like for him as he was walking through the woods of the wilderness. I don't know I highly recommend people visiting there because it's just it's basically bushwhacking if you had to fight there. I mean, it's almost impenetrable. I can only imagine what it must have been like for him to be walking through these woods without much training. I don't know if he even fired his gun. And the first thing that happened to him as he's walking through those woods is that he got shot. So the the Union forces under Reeves's brigade, he was under James Rice's brigade in Wadsworth's division. But anyway, they were walking through the woods and the Confederates opened fire, and Reeves got hit through his left cheekbone, and the ball came out the right cheekbone. So like I said, it would have looked horrific. He would have had a lot of bleeding, but the initial ball didn't hit an artery. So it was one of those ghastly wounds that actually probably wasn't so bad at first. It was probably the surgeons probably thought it was survivable when it first happened. One thing, of course, though, that they didn't have back then was x-rays. And so the Reeves, after getting hit in the mouth, in the face, would have been brought to a field hospital, a mile or so from the main line. And he would have had surgery on that afternoon of May 5th. And the surgery would have been pretty basic, just to remove bone fragments from his mouth and from his cheek. And of course, given the technology of the time, they would have just gotten what they could see, right? But of course, x-rays are needed. This is where consulting with a doctor was very helpful, is that he said the real danger is that it's the little ones that you can't see that are the problem, because they're, it's sharp, and if you move around, it could hit an artery or cause internal tissue damage or what have you. And I'm sure that's what happened, right? They obviously cleaned out his mouth as best they could. but they probably weren't able to get all of the bone fragments out of his mouth. And so he would have been in a lot of pain. Like I said, he probably wouldn't have wanted to move. One thing that we don't know, that wasn't clear from the file, it wasn't clear whether his jaw was broken, because it mentions that his cheekbones were hit, but I'm not sure if the jaw itself also was hit. And I don't know if his tongue was in the way or not. I don't want to get gruesome, but if obviously that would have mattered about whether he would have been able to talk or not. Yeah, you know, what's funny is, like, I completely understand that wounds are not everyone's cup of tea, and so I don't want to gross anybody out or be to go too far. But at the same time, it's something I was fascinated about, because I think that the medical piece, right, is important to understand the ordeal that these soldiers went through, because so many of them were wounded, and that the medical care isn't what we're accustomed to. But you know, surprisingly, it was better than you think. That oftentimes the Union Army had gotten better in the way they treated the wounded by 1864. It was truly horrific in 1862. And some of the tales about the Second Battle of Bull Run, you know, you had nurses that were drunk, and you had ambulance drivers who were former musicians, and it was sort of madness, and many of the wounded were left to suffer on the battlefield afterwards. So because of that mismanagement, they really ramped up the care. And so by the time of the Wilderness, it was a lot better. But nonetheless, though, it was still difficult, right? It was still, you had to get, the challenge was that you had to get them from the field hospitals in the Wilderness to Fredericksburg and then up to Washington, D.C. And that's no small thing to get 7,000 soldiers that distance, because the general hospitals had better surgeons and better equipment and better supplies and that sort of thing. So that was a key part of it. So I mentioned that, so Reeves arrives on May 12th, you know, he's in Stanton Hospital, and on May 12th, he suffers a secondary hemorrhage. And the surgeons try their best to close the artery, but unfortunately, and this is also very painful, they didn't have time to give him an anesthetic, so they had to do it without him having any pain relief. But they tried to do it by hand to tie with a thread the artery. But unfortunately, that surgery failed, and Reeves died on the early morning of May 13th, 1864, and he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery on May 14th, 1864. And so in the book, I kind of write a little bit about how, in some ways, it couldn't have been less heroic in a way. This, you know, this 19-year-old substitute who is walking into the woods, and before the battle's even started, he gets wounded, and the next thing you know, he's being brought up to DC. But at the same time, it really was heroic, and it was quite brave that he didn't desert. He was in his place in the line, and he volunteered as a substitute. Of course, he did get some money, but nonetheless, he did his duty, and that was considered something special back then. And of course, now he's at Arlington National Cemetery, one of our most revered institutions in this country, and there he is for eternity. So I think that it's sort of a story that this small town, Victor, New York of all places, I think that the name Victor is interesting, but he earned a place on America's Field of Honor at Arlington. So I think I just want to finish up. I'll try to, we want to have some time for questions. So I'll just take Kelly, I'll just try to be quick, and then we'll have some time for questions. But I conclude the book by a very sad story about Private William Reeves's father. His father's name was Theophilus Reeves. And according to a book called The History of Ontario County, Theophilus didn't know what happened to his son William in the Wilderness, and so he joined the Union Army so he could go look for him. And so imagine that this older man joins the army so he can look for his lost son. It's very melodramatic and it's very sad. It didn't happen, of course. It didn't take me long. It wasn't like I needed to be Sherlock Holmes. It took me minutes to realize that there was another Theophilus Reeves in the same area, but it wasn't the same person. Number one, he was younger than William's father, but number two, his name was spelled differently, and he left the army before the Battle of the Wilderness, so it was obviously not him. No, Theophilus was older, and he didn't join the Union Army to look for his son because they knew that William died. William's widow applied for a pension straight away. And she lived in Victor, New York as well. And so she got her pension within a week of his death. And it was modest, but probably enough. And she married later that year and had a son, her first son, with her new husband, who she named William. So that's sort of a little poetic, but nonetheless, it's not surprising though to me that this sad story would take hold, because there were so many losses and there were so many missing soldiers. Among the Union Army, 40% of the dead soldiers remain unidentified, 40%. And among African-American Union soldiers, that number of unidentified soldiers was 66%. So imagine the pain of not knowing whether your child was dead or not. I think that you assumed as such, right? As you know, after the months, they often wrote to Clara Barton to help find their missing children, and she did tremendous work finding 22,000 previously missing soldiers. She had set up something called the Friends of Missing Men of the U.S. Army. So anyway, I think I'm going to conclude there because I want to have time for questions. But it's kind of a sad ending to the book, but it's really to underline the sort of loss and the suffering. And I think my sort of overarching thesis is that a trauma like this has to still be with us. And I think the fact that we're still arguing about the Civil War today is maybe a result of all that trauma in those woods. Okay, so questions, Kelly.
Well, thank you so much. And I have an interest in the medical aspect of the Civil War and love hearing about all those gory wounds. So, and I know at least one of our viewers did as well. I think Cindy commented that she always checks out the medical museum anytime she goes to a battlefield. The first question, I think this was in regard to maybe just the soldiers going into battle, knowing the casualty rates were high. Was the Battle of the Wilderness unique in this regard? I think it's in relationship to that. Maybe it was in a relationship to the trees catching fire. So I'm not quite sure.
Oh yeah. So so you know what? When I started off by mentioning what it must have felt like to just be in the Union Army at the beginning of the Overland Campaign. But no, I think that it wasn't unique really to the Wilderness. Certainly the fires was an additional variable that they had to consider. But no, I think I was thinking more about how at the beginning of the Overland Campaign, the fighting was pretty brutal, right? Maybe the one difference between the Overland Campaign and what had come before is the constant nature of it. It was every day. There were no breaks. You know, it was the Wilderness, and then it was Spotsylvania, and then it was North Anna, and then it was Cold Harbor. And so it was, one big battle. And so I was just trying to convey that feeling of being in an army and knowing that the probability of you surviving was pretty slim as you marched over the Rapidan River on May 4th.
So it was very relentless. And then Cindy asked, isn't it Cold Harbor that gave us the idea for current day dog tags? And I know that the men did write their names and their information on their uniforms and kind of pinned it to them.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, that was true at Cold Harbor. And I think it was true at some earlier battles as well. That, yeah, they knew that, the things could go poorly and they would write their name down. So, that, people could identify them afterwards.
And Mike asked, did the wounded soldiers that were abandoned alive, did they become prisoners of war?
Yeah, so great question. And some did. So basically, the Union Army went southeast to Spotsylvania Courthouse. And so they left that area in the wilderness behind. And so for a while, the Confederates had some command over it, and they did capture those who were left behind. But then the Confederates, too, the nature of the fighting, they needed to head south, and they couldn't hang around too long either. And so it was a very fluid situation. And so, as I said, some were captured, some were rescued because they were captured, and then they were left. The Confederates didn't want to take these severely wounded people with them either. And then, of course, some died because the ones that were left behind were the ones that were in the most critical state, to be honest.
All right. And then Joe has a question about Meade's role and his performance. So how do you assess his role? And then also, what's your opinion on the historiography around the battle?
Yeah, so great question. And I do talk a little bit about this in the book, is that Meade was in sort of a no-win situation. He had been the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Then Grant comes in, and Grant is sort of like, I'm going to let you run the show just as you've always done, except 5 minutes into the battle, he's, Grant's setting up camp next door to him. And of course, and it's only natural, right? Anyone who's ever had a boss knows that it doesn't take too long for the boss to assert their authority over you. I'm only joking, but you can see how that would happen. So yeah. Meade is in a difficult situation because on the one hand, he does have all of the responsibility that comes with overseeing his corps commanders, making sure that the tactics and making sure that the strategy, the plan is being implemented. And at the same time, Grant is kind of changing things on the fly and looking over his shoulder and making sure he's aggressive enough and is going to push the action to Lee. So it was hard. And so two things. I'll try not to go on too long because this is a big topic. But one thing that I will say is that Meade always felt like he didn't get enough credit for his role, number one. And number two, it was very much illustrated. Remember when I spoke about Grant's night march? Well, someone started a rumor that Meade was advocating for going back across the Rapidan River. And Meade was outraged by that. He said, it's a lie, I never said that. And he even had a member of the press kicked out of the camp and put on a horse and made to march away because Meade was so angry because that they would vote that what he felt was making him look like a coward. And to Grant's credit, Grant stuck up for Meade. And he told the powers that be back in Washington that Meade never advocated retreating. But anyway, there was that tension between the two. As it for the historiography, oh gosh, it's a big topic. I will say that I deliberately set out not to write an academic book. I have a great respect for the academics like Gordon Ray and some of these others who've written military histories of this. I didn't set out to write an academic. I wanted to tell a story. I was a former professor and teacher, and I have an academic background, but this is more of a story. So I would say there's a lot of great work being done. There's someone who's written a book recently that makes the argument that the wilderness wasn't quite the barrier to fighting that some people believe it to be, and there's some that believe that maybe Grant was more of a tactician vis-a-vis Lee, and there's a lot of different interpretations. But like I said, I didn't try to get too bogged down in the historiography because I was trying to write a story and really try to look at it through the eyes of these Union soldiers.
All right, thank you. And so there's a question about the wilderness itself and why was it so uncultivated? Why was it a wilderness? Yeah. And then a little bit about the area today, if you could share that.
Sure. So I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's about, it's located west of Fredericksburg, about 10 miles or so west of Fredericksburg, and of course, due south of the Rapidan River. You can cross it at you can cross the highway at what was the Germanna Ford, where they crossed in 1864. But as for the wilderness itself, yes, it's all these kind of scrubland, and I actually did a lot of research on this because I'm just sort of personally interested in it. And the best argument for why the wilderness is the way it is, with all of these sort of like scrubby bushes that are kind of half grown and kind of densely thickets and tight forest, is that these were heavily farmed with, these were heavily tobacco, these lands were used for tobacco in the 18th century, and that tobacco was very bad for the soil and it depleted the soil. And then eventually it led to these kind of stunted shrubs and trees down there. It also became a mining region in the early 19th century as well, for iron and even some gold and some other minerals. And so it was, it was an industrial area. First it was used for tobacco, but then it was used for mining, and so it was a center of work, and it resulted in this kind of difficult environment. The worst place to fight, probably, although, except for that book I told you about earlier that says, oh, that's overplayed. But in my opinion, having visited on several occasions and read the memoir accounts, it just doesn't seem like a place where you would want to fight. And according to Grant and some of his officers on his team, is they were hoping that they wouldn't have to fight in the wilderness, but they had to stay the night there of May 4th, and the night of May 4th and morning of May 5th, because they needed to remain reasonably close to their supply train, and that they had to spend the night there. And Lee, of course, pressed. Lee didn't attack them, but he just moved Ewell and Hill so close as to put the pressure on Grant, and Grant was, okay, if you want to fight here, I'll fight here. But it wasn't an ideal place, in my opinion, to fight, but others might disagree.
And getting back to Reeves, whom you talked about toward the end, why was he buried at Arlington instead of in his hometown?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, prior to May 12th, the soldiers that died in the area DC hospitals were buried at a place called the Old Soldiers' Home. And so many of the soldiers that had burials at the Old Soldier Home and then later Arlington, initially they were usually poor soldiers that couldn't afford to have their bodies preserved and sent home by train to their families. And so, they were just buried locally. And in Reeves's case, the Old Soldiers' Home literally filled up on May 12th, and they were starting to have burials at Lee's estate on May 13th and 14th, in his case, May 14th. One interesting side note of that is that I write about in the book is that initially there were Union soldiers staying in Lee's house, his manor house on the estate. And Montgomery Meigs had asked that the Union soldiers be buried close to the house so the Lees would never return. But the people that were living there were like, we don't really want dead bodies near the house. So they had the first burials at the very far northeastern part of the estate, in what is now Section 27 of Arlington National Cemetery. Meigs saw that was going on, and he was like, no, I want the soldiers closer to the house. And so now Section 27 later that summer became where African-American soldiers were buried, and also African-American civilians from DC were buried. So nowadays, Section 27 is mostly African-Americans, with these early white soldiers like Reeves and Private William Christman, who was the first burial. This is Section 27, whereas going forward, all of the Union soldiers were buried closer to the house.
All right, and let's kind of end on kind of one last grouping of questions. These concern substitutes. So
Yeah.
the question was, would Reeves have been drafted later had he not signed on as a substitute? And then could you talk a little bit about substitutes? There's a question about could you choose your regiment if you were a substitute? What was the price for a substitute in the Confederate States Army? Let's see, I thought there was another substitute question, but maybe that was that. Yeah,
Yeah.
just kind
So,
of the price as well
oh
as
yeah.
kind of what it meant to be a substitute.
Yeah. So, great question, and there's a lot to it. It's a big topic, so I'll try to be brief. But yeah, so Reeves was 19 at the time, so he signed on as a substitute. Yeah, he would have been subject to the draft in a couple of years had he, you know, he volunteered as a substitute in '63. I'm trying to think. It would have been close. He may have just missed it. Future drafts, but nonetheless, he volunteered as a substitute. He got $300 from a man by the name of Humphrey, who also lived in Victor, New York. So they would have known each other. And no, you didn't get to choose what your regiment. So he got assigned the regiment that was going to be taking the drafted men from that county. They lived in Victor. Both Humphrey and Reeves lived in the same small town. And you know, there was a lot of sense that this was unfair, right? That, you know, it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight sort of thing, right? But I think for Reeves, $300 was at least a meaningful amount of money to him. It seems so not a lot of money to us. But yeah, the substitutes, you know, this was associated, of course, with the draft that was implemented for the first time in 1863. And you've probably heard about the New York City draft riots. This was not popular to have a draft. And that there were guys like Reeves that, you know, saw it as a good thing. But I think that the draft was mostly not an efficient way for the Union to get men. And frankly, by the time of the Overland Campaign, you know, it wasn't popular to be in the Army because of what I started my talk with about all of those bad outcomes that might happen. And that one last thing I will say about this is that when the draft was implemented, a lot of the older folks, they had an option for you to get out of military service if you had something wrong with you, right? And a lot of the older folks were noticing, it feels like our young folk aren't as healthy as they used to be, because everybody was coming up with 1,000,001 reasons why they were injured or couldn't serve in the line because of the sort of unpopularity of having being in the Army.
And as far as the price substitutes got paid, it wasn't a flat fee, was it? Didn't it just kind of depend upon who was hiring the substitute?
So it tended to be around $300,
Okay.
but you're right, it could be negotiated, it could be more. And there could often be other bounties that would be offered by a local community. So yeah, it could turn into a considerable amount of money. But my best sense is that Reeves got 300, and I think he got a small bonus from, I have it in his military record, like another 100 from the United States government, because it was sad to see in his file so the balance sheet of what he owed and what they owed him after he passed, and it was very clinical, the numbers, you know, it was, you know, you owe us $34 and we owe you another $65, and this would have all gone to his wife, Anna, who he had married, Anna Barnett and Anna Reeves, who he had married right before he joined the Army.
Well, thank you so much for this very informative talk that covered just so many different aspects of the Overland Campaign, the Battle of the Wilderness. And if I know I saw a lot of comments about people wanting to read the book, wanting to buy the book. So we do have it in our shop. So you can go to our website at acwm.org if you want to purchase the book from us. And I'm sure you can go to other sites as well. So thank you so much. Thank you all for tuning in tonight.
Thank you.
And I'll look forward to seeing many of you, hopefully on June 24th. So everyone have a good evening.
You too. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.